Right. Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. Um, if you don't know me, my name is Mary Wright. I work at the City of Phoenix in the Office of Heat Response and Mitigation. Um, Typically, this group is led by our fearless leader Ann Richmond with ASU. She was unable to be here today, so I'm on bat here. Um, we are the for those that are new, we're the Arizona Heat Research and Data Work Group. So we meet once a month and we share the latest heat research and data findings, and we also try to discuss future data and research needs. Um, if you all could also start putting your name and affiliation in the chat, that'll help us keep track of who's here, um, and kind of serves as our attendance so we know who's coming to these meetings. Um, and yeah, I'm part of the steering committee, essentially for this group, which is made up. There's a number of us from different organizations, including Anne from ASU, of course, U of A. We have Lad Keith and Hallie Hughes. Um, with the National Weather Service, we have Tom Frieders, City of Phoenix, myself, and David Hondula, who's also ASU. And City of Tempe, we have Carissa Fowler. And with AZDHS, we have Eugene LeVar, Jennifer Botsford, and Taylor Ludich. Um, Grateful to have everyone uh, committed to bringing us all the latest heat research and data. Um, I think, is this meeting being recorded? Yeah, I think it's already set to record. Okay, cool. So just letting everyone know the meeting is being recorded so we can share this presentation later. Um, and I guess I'll just move on over to our the star of the show here. Today's presentation is going to be led by Lad Keith and supported by Hallie Hughes. Lad is a recent recipient of the Distinguished Scholar Award, which is a very prestigious award from the U of A honoring excellence in teaching, research, and service. So we are in good hands today. Um, but yeah, Lad's going to lead us through a presentation of some of his work, and we're going to follow it up with a sort of participatory activity for the group related to the presentation. So I will let Lad take it away.
Great. Thanks, Mary. Go ahead and share my screen here. And yeah, I think we're kind of doing dual duty with this presentation today. So kind of an opportunity for me to share some of our team's heat planning and governance research. It's going to be a very high level presentation. And I know there's folks who've seen parts of this before, so we'll be very high level. But I think the one of the ideas is that I'll kind of talk about the different categories of strategies that we've been looking at for addressing heat. And the idea is that after the presentation, which I'll try to keep short, we'll have a Mentimeter poll. And the idea here is that we're kind of looking for feedback as a working group on the types of future presentations you would like to have us kind of recruit people to present on. And then also providing some information on the types of topics you think need more research. And so we'll kind of have both of those opportunities for you to provide input on after this presentation. So, and I think the other thing is now that the state has institutionalized some of the different working groups. This working group is still kind of finding its ground and figuring out how to be productive and constructive with all of the efforts to address heat in Arizona. And so I know that this group has kind of the balance has shifted a little bit, and I believe we have a little bit more of the folks from the research side and some students here. So some feedback on that would be helpful for us to kind of understand the best kind of the best use of our time when we meet too. So, but on to the presentation. So my research group focuses on quite a few things. I direct the Heat Resilience Initiative here at the University of Arizona. But today I'll talk a little bit about some of our heat planning and governance work. And again, very high level, but just know that a lot of this work has been kind of fed into it by interviews with decision makers across not just Arizona, but across the United States and the world. lots of literature reviews and different surveys and kind of plan analysis too. So we've kind of drawn from a lot of practical, like on the ground information on how different cities and states and countries are actually addressing heat. And so just kind of putting this out there, Sarah Miro is my colleague who is at Arizona State University, and she's moving over to UC Boulder soon, starting this fall. But we wrote the APA, or American Planning Association's first book, Planning for Urban Heat Resilience. And this was really the first time that heat resilience was defined in kind of a professional publication. And so we said here that heat resilience is proactively mitigating and managing urban heat across all of the systems and sectors that it affects. And I'll talk about heat mitigation and management coming up on the next few slides. And then just thought it'd be good for this group to kind of, see how we lay out the 7 principles for quality urban heat resilience planning too. And so this stems from a lot of governance and planning literature work and taking that and kind of moving it into the realm of how we prepare and respond to heat. So number one, setting clear urban heat goals and associated metrics for success. This was obviously published with planners in mind, but you can imagine the same thing for public health emergency management. Building a comprehensive fact base of information on heat risks, developing a diverse portfolio of strategies, both heat mitigation and management, managing uncertainty. And what we mean by uncertainty there is kind of uncertainty about the quality of information, managing uncertainty about the fiscal resources that are coming to you, uncertainty about forecasts and climate change projections. Coordinating across planning efforts is number 5. Having an inclusive participation planning process to include the public and kind of grassroots groups. And then number 7, effective implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So you can kind of understand what effect your strategies and actions are having, and then loop those back up to setting goals and tweaking those metrics for success in the future. And so again, this will help us hopefully guide our Mentimeter conversation later. But for the different strategies, so again, myself and Sarah Miro did quite a few literature reviews and kind of surveys of cities across the US, starting in 2020, really looking at the different strategies that communities were using to address heat. And we found that most of them fell into 2 broad buckets. And so the first is heat mitigation, or strategies that are really aimed at reducing the built environment's contribution to the urban heat island effect. So kind of things like reducing waste heat from vehicles and buildings, things like urban greening, so planting more trees and using green stormwater infrastructure. And then kind of more on the building side, urban design, so kind of site-specific things like creating cool breezeways and shaded kind of walk areas, and then kind of larger land use patterns. And so things like preserving open space and making sure that you don't concentrate too many dense buildings in one place that blocks off airflow. And then the second bucket is heat management. And so those are the strategies that prepare and respond to chronic and acute heat risk. And these often fall more into kind of the public health and emergency preparedness realm, which I know historically this group has kind of focused more on. So we'll have a couple of Mentimeter questions that divide this one out a little bit more. In addition to public health and emergency preparedness, things like thinking of personal heat exposure. So I'm kind of looking at Jenny Vanos' square on my Zoom, but things like how do schoolyards deal with extreme heat for children, or how do you deal with heat at the workplace, or potentially like recreation areas or for athletes, right? And so kind of thinking of people's heat exposure across all of the activities that they may be doing. And then fourth one for heat management is thinking about the energy grid. And so kind of like accessibility of energy, affordability, how resilient the energy grid is to disruptions and things like that. And I've talked a lot about these, but again, just to kind of go through them super quickly, under heat mitigation, talked about land use, urban design, urban greening, and reducing waste heat. And then again, under heat management, some other things that we would commonly think of would be cooling centers or their operation of resilience hubs, potentially weatherization and energy assistance programs. We would put early warning systems and kind of forecasting into the heat management side, heat education and awareness campaigns, potentially like OSHA regulations that we were working on at the national level, and the have some proposals at the state level here. And then, like I mentioned, energy grid resilience too. And so I will just point out, so like I said, I won't get too much into all of the various things that my group researches, but I will point out a lot of the research that has been done to date on extreme heat and kind of addressing heat is very city focused. So it makes sense because if you look at any area of research, we tend to concentrate on our research where the universities are, right? And most universities are in large cities. So the cities have a greater proportion of the nation's population, so that all makes sense, right? But what that sort of means is that we've overemphasized kind of reducing the urban heat island when we talk about like addressing extreme heat. And so just kind of pointing out that rural heat, which is a major concern here in Arizona, is kind of a vastly under-researched area. And so a lot of the strategies that we've developed to address extreme heat, like planting trees or cool pavement or opening cooling centers, may be less appropriate depending on how spread out the population is and how rural they are, right? And so just kind of pointing that out because even I think we're certainly guilty of this too. A lot of our heat response efforts in Arizona focus on Phoenix and Tucson metropolitan areas and kind of forget about everyone else that lives in the smaller towns and communities around us. So it is important. We did a couple of studies. One found that health risks are often greater in rural areas. And so when we looked at emergency medical services across the US, kind of those response calls, and found that the odds of the emergency medical service call resulting in a positive outcome was 24% greater for an urban patient than a rural patient, which makes sense, right? Because if you're a rural patient, it's going to take a lot longer to get you to medical facilities. So that's not surprising, but it's good to have numbers to put on that. Like I said, we did a literature review on rural heat and had already mentioned this, but a lot of the strategies we've been developing and focusing on for city areas aren't necessarily as appropriate or effective for rural areas. And then just the types of folks that might be vulnerable to heat in those rural areas in Arizona. And then the intersectional vulnerabilities of rural areas, which often have poor quality housing and kind of more unstable energy grid available to them too. And so kind of just the idea that our efforts kind of in Arizona, but also across the nation are really lagging in rural areas compared to cities. And then I'll kind of wrap up on some of our heat governance work here. So kind of pulling everything together, we wrote a Nature comment piece back in 2021, and Sarah Miro was a co-author as well as Dave Handula, who's on this call. But we defined heat governance as the actors, strategies, processes, and institutions that guide decision making for mitigating and managing heat as a hazard. And this has really caught on, and I'll kind of talk about how it's been adopted in a couple of different places. But again, just the idea that previous to the last like 5 or 10 years, we really haven't seen the governance of heat as a hazard compared to other hazards like flooding or wildfire, earthquakes, droughts, sea level rise even. And so it's really just been the last, I would say probably safely 5 years that we really have seen kind of heat governance as an idea take off. Sarah Miro and I wrote another comment piece where we mapped out some of the critical disciplines to heat governance. And so again, this is kind of stemming from some of our survey work. This doesn't mean that these are the only disciplines that are critical to heat governance, but kind of globally, we often see that these 4 disciplines often play a critical role as communities are first addressing heat for the first time. And so meteorology and climatology, of course, public health, emergency management, although that's called disaster management and in an international context, and then urban planning and design. And so we really kind of see those 4 disciplines as really being at the table in a lot of different places, whether it's the United States or India, Australia, Asia, right? So those 4 disciplines kind of often come to the table first. We mapped out some examples of how heat governance is set up kind of from a multi-scalar governance perspective in Phoenix. And so you can kind of see here the NGO level, so kind of non-governmental organizations and kind of going across those disciplines again. So meteorology in blue, public health, emergency management, urban design and planning, and heat governance. And the idea here isn't that we're trying to fill out every square for everything, but just kind of trying to understand where responsibility does lie in different places And so we've done this for a couple of cities, kind of from the grassroots level all the way up to the national level. And it's just interesting to see how it really is organized very differently in different places, right? And so you can see kind of here, and everyone knows this, it's common sense. We deal with meteorology with just our National Weather Service offices. So that's kind of just the responsibility of the National Weather Service, right? Public health, though, is basically kind of we have multiple levels to coordinate. We don't have a city organization, but they certainly do coordinate with the city, right? And so kind of from the NGO, county, state, all the way up to the national with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Emergency management, similarly, kind of all levels of governance is concerned with that. Urban planning and design, a little bit different because in the United States, at least, it's mostly a local responsibility. So it's really just the cities that are in charge of how we plan. And then kind of what's specifically focused on heat governance. In the US at the national level, we have NIHIS. And then, of course, the city of Phoenix has the Office of Heat Mitigation and Response. And so just again, kind of important to see where responsibilities lie for different things and who just the number of people that are involved with coordinating for resources and kind of responsibility as we prepare to address extreme heat. And again, this mapping of kind of governance responsibilities varies by city, varies by nation, certainly. We also recently did interviews with all of the chief heat officers across the world, which sounds really impressive, but there's only 13 of them or so. We interviewed some of the past ones too. And so we did capture the ones who had previous roles that are no longer in those positions, but just kind of an example of some of the cities and locations where we were able to get some insights from chief heat officers. And chief heat officers, of course, I think everyone on this call is aware, but would be the folks that have the sole responsibility of their duty is addressing extreme heat, right? And as we know, they're not the only people working on extreme heat because we have public health folks on the call who certainly deal with it as a lot of their job. But these would be the folks that are kind of the point of responsibility for their organization with extreme heat. And what we found through those interviews were we thematically analyzed the results for those. And so we found six kind of main considerations for chief heat officers. I'll start with number six first, actually. We did interview quite a few from the global south. And so just one consideration was addressing extreme heat in the global south is just vastly different than the global north, right? And again, not a surprise, but the number of different challenges that they have to addressing extreme heat is kind of outweighs a lot of the stuff that we do here in like the United States. And so that was one finding was just the number of different problems that chief heat officers in the global south are kind of constrained to address extreme heat by. But some common things across all of them, whether regardless of location, was kind of the issue of making heat a central policy issue. And so kind of the challenge of really raising heat and getting awareness on it. And so the chief heat officers talked about, especially when they first start, that's one of their main roles of the goals of the role is just to kind of raise awareness about what heat is and how they should be addressing it better. They all talked about the challenges with coordination and collaboration. And again, imagine the last slide with all of these different organizations and kind of agencies involved. They talked about the challenge of implementing anything that they planned. And so a lot of them have kind of very novel department setups where they might be the only staff person, or they might be under a mayor. And so kind of like their ability to actually implement the things that they were planning and recommending was limited in a lot of cases. I think we have a good example with Dave Hundul and the city of Phoenix of a positive example of how to kind of actually go and get action from some of the policy recommendations, though. And then number four, experiencing turbulence. So just kind of changes in funding. I think we've experienced that in the United States with the federal administration changeover. And then five, strategic management. And again, just the idea that depending on where they are positioned within their government really kind of depends on what they focus on, right? And so some were from a public health background and focused in a public health department. And so obviously a lot of their strategies were public health focused. And I think of Eugene LeVar, who's our state level chief heat officer, right? And so that obviously flavors what you kind of focus on. The ones that were from a mayor's office might have been focused often a little more on kind of PR and kind of public engagement and being out there in front with the mayor to talk to the public. And then a few did have more of a planning and design background. And so obviously for them, things like cooling the city and heat mitigation was a greater focus. So just kind of a little bit interesting that depending on where you are in the government, really flavors the kind of responses that you do. And then I'll wrap up with two slides. So a lot of the work that we've been doing has been put into action. And so our team, and again, our team is not just myself, but many people at the U of A and folks at ASU too. So students and Sarah Miro and others. We've worked with the city of Tucson to review and provide recommendations for the heat action roadmap that was adopted in 2024. And then one of our students, Shaylin Trigo, is doing her PhD and helped review the Shade Phoenix plan that was adopted in 2024 too. So kind of a lot of the work that we've been doing has kind of filtered into actual policies and plans that have been adopted. And then, like I mentioned, the heat governance work that we've done and the framework that we've created was put into the National Heat Strategy that was adopted by NOAA and the Biden administration back in 2024. Unfortunately, that's since been removed and is no longer an acting guiding document. But I think it's still important that we have this blueprint in the future if we ever do return to a point where we want to have a national heat strategy plan. We have a really good kind of roadmap for what works in the US. And then last year, I was in Geneva for my sabbatical in the fall and worked on this extreme heat risk governance framework and toolkit, which is kind of the same idea, but at a global scale. And so has a really nice heat governance assessment tool in it that we've been testing out. And kind of actions that are kind of internationally replicatable for different countries from the state level all the way down to the city level for kind of increasing heat governance. And so that one's been adopted by the United Nations, and they're doing some pilots with that currently this year. So kind of just showing that the lessons that we've learned from Arizona really have had a global impact, which is really exciting to see. And so with that, let's see the time here. Okay, 3:25, so not too bad for an academic, right, Mary? So leaving more than half the time for the Mentimeter and conversation. So the idea now is that we're going to turn it over to Hallie. Well, I will turn it over to Hallie. We'll pull up the Mentimeter in a second. And I think what we want to do again is with kind of the knowledge that's here in those that attend the working group, really want to get some of your ideas for topics you'd like to see us recruit for future presentations. But these could also be topics that you think need more data or research that would support your work. If you're a practitioner or if you're actually working on these areas, feel free to put in things that you think are under-researched too. So we're really kind of looking for what are the areas of research that are really needed and what would you like to hear from? So with that, Hallie, I think I will
Absolutely.
stop my screen share and let you and Mary take over.
Yeah. And I'll just say real quick while we're transitioning, if anyone has any questions or comments, uh, feel free to speak up.
Oh yeah, of course. Well, yeah, I should have said that too. If anyone does have questions about the work that I showed, would be happy to answer those too. So,
Uh, Rebecca?
Hi, thank you so much, Lad, for presenting that. And I think it's so important to talk about governance, and it's not something that everybody wants to talk to. And you definitely highlighted this. However, so you highlighted that it's different in every city, state, and county, and that it's different globally than it might be the United States. One of the pieces that I'm struggling with is, I look at the information that you presented, and I walk away thinking if I didn't work in the system myself, that emergency management and public health are all sort of doing an equal part when it comes to heat mitigation. And I'm only going to speak for Arizona, and specifically more so for Maricopa County, although I think this is fairly true across Arizona. Public health is really sort of the lead agency in Arizona heat response, and I don't I think it's important that emergency management be involved. I think part of the reason is because traditionally the emergency management framework doesn't include heat as an emergency, and we spent a lot of time trying to convince the federal government to make heat an emergency. But the way they look at emergency is it has to do with damage, and so I actually stopped pushing for that because I'm not sure it's even going to help. But somehow we have to either get emergency management to see heat as an emergency or perhaps just start focusing on public health to lead the way.
Yeah, no, so I completely agree. And here in Arizona, I think we have had public health really lead the way. And I think part of it's because of the heat-related illnesses and deaths that became so apparent. And and it's just kind of lined up that public health here, at least, is the ones that are really coordinating cooling centers. That's why we have Eugene LeVar, who's in AZDHS, right? That's not the way that it is in some other cities in the US, or certainly globally. A lot of the efforts are actually stemming from like urban planning and design. So I don't think that there's one right way to do it, but I think we do have an interesting formula that's worked out well with public health leading it that does kind of yeah, I think it's just important to be aware that if any agency is the lead and gets the resources, the other disciplines that should be involved sometimes stop being involved as much because they see it as their responsibility, right? And so I would
Right.
say that's where here in Arizona we still need to encourage like the urban planners and all of those that are charged with kind of designing the future look of our cities to not just like hand it over to public health, right? So.
So yeah, not suggesting that we
Yeah.
rule out the others, but I think there is a little bit of an overemphasis on emergency management. And if
Yeah.
and if that continues to be the way that things are approached, then we've got to attack this at a national level to get them to recognize heat as an emergency.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. Yeah,
Yeah,
David, go ahead.
this is David. So I'm going to pile on to what Rebecca just said. And say yes. Um, First of all, I think your work is great, and because we really know so little about how to deal with this, I think all the various pieces and all the various agencies are important. But there's a real gap here. We don't really have enough physicians and hospitals involved in all this. They're taking care of the people who do survive long enough to actually make it to a hospital. We're not getting, I think from your report, I don't really get a sense of the fact that there's 500, 600 people every year dying of heat stroke. This is a crisis. This is a problem. This is a disaster. Although I think the governance and mitigation are really critical and all part of the plan, I'm not sure that we're able to convey the seriousness of what we have. And I know Rebecca has been trying to work on getting, the disaster folks around the country and I think some of our legislators too, that, some of the money that's allocated to disasters, but hasn't really come to the problems of heat. We're willing to give money to tornadoes and to earthquakes and to hurricanes, but because we have 3 months of people dying in the streets of heat, it's not perceived in the same way. And I think also probably because of the fact that buildings aren't destroyed and
Hmm.
other, property is not part of it. So we're not losing, that piece. But this really does need to be recognized as the real disaster that it is. And I don't think that's true. So, right now the money in healthcare, it's in the hospitals, it's in the doctors, it's in the insurance companies. And somehow some of that money needs to somehow get moved into the work that we need to do to save, the 500 or 600 people that are dying every year. And I think we need to see it as something that's just unacceptable. Yes, I think the governance is great, and again, I'm going to cite all your papers because I think they're wonderful. But somehow we need to increase the sense of crisis that this really is.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that comment. And Yeah, and I especially when I do talks, I do commonly talk say exactly what you said, where if you look at the amount that FEMA spends on other disasters, heat is still a very small drop in the bucket, right? And partially it's due because we care more about property and infrastructure and kind of saving that than we care about saving people sometimes, right? And you can argue that it's because heat's not listed on the on the FEMA list of disasters, but neither was COVID, and FEMA put billions of dollars into COVID, right? And so there's other reasons for heat being kind of left off of that. I will just say other parts of the world are certainly taking it more seriously. I think Arizona's done a good job out of all the states for the United States, right? But the governance has been helpful because some of the other countries just haven't even known where to start, right? And a lot of the action for, again, places like India or Singapore, it's been the national government that's kind of said, like, what do we need to do to help protect people at a local level? And so at least like from the World Bank perspective or Red Cross or the United Nations, they are putting like millions and millions of dollars into this in developing nations now, which is good to see. So, but yeah, and obviously the United States is a little bit of a different story right now, right? So yeah, and the only other thing, David, I'll say is agree with we need to include more of the medicine folks, kind of the actual practitioners of
Yeah.
those who deal with patients, obviously. But we also need money for things like weatherizing homes and making sure that folks have like working air conditioners. I would argue, is on the governor's heat safety labor task force, and we recommended some pretty stringent ideas for heat safety labor laws in Arizona. I believe they're kind of turning into more broad recommendations, which is a little bit disappointing to see. And so there's a lot of different ways to tackle it, right? So,
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think we need all of the above, and basically, attack this from many angles. I'm just disappointed that the medical community has not gotten on board to a greater extent. One thing that I have brought up before, and I'll bring it up now, is death review teams, which do exist for many other recognized problems, whether it's intimate partner violence or opioids or pediatric deaths or whatever it might be. The nice thing about death review teams is that you're actually able to get all the agencies that are involved in either responding or preventing or managing, the police and the fire department and the doctors and the lawyers and the planners, all sitting in the room together to look at uh, a bunch of cases and actually say, okay, what could we have done that might have prevented this particular really bad thing, this person from dying?
mhm.
What could we have done? And then actually come up with a to-do list. Okay, this is the take home. It may be that some of these will just say, oh my God, it's just another person who took meth and fentanyl and collapsed in a park. Nothing we can do about it. But I think we might find that if we were all sitting in the room together and looking at and hearing the stories, of who these people are, not just look at the data, but actually the real people, the real stories, the real sad outcomes, maybe, we could get a little bit more momentum to actually do something.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Yeah, Mary, let's I'll put my email in the chat just if anyone else has anything they'd like to discuss further, any other questions. But Mary, why don't we turn it over to the Mentimeter now? And actually, like David's idea, if we need more stories from people, that should go on this Mentimeter list. So definitely suggest things like that. Like what could we work on to kind of improve our response to extreme heat? So, Mary, are you going to
Cool.
guide the discussion? And Hallie, do you want to pull up the screen to show folks? How do we want to handle this?
I think we might do it the other way around.
Okay.
Hallie's having some screen sharing issues, so she's still gonna advance the slides so we can move to new questions, but I have at least I have the answers incoming on my screen I can share. So
We can
one
all review
moment.
together.
Um, I will share.
Yeah. But the first one is on energy. And I see folks have been responding to that. I can share the link one more time in the meeting. If you click this, it should take you to the Mentimeter where you can input your answers to this one. So we have them broken up into the kind of sections that Lad was mentioning before on management, mitigation, and governance. If you put one in for the wrong topic, that's okay. They're all going to end up recorded, even if they're not exactly in order. That's okay.
Yeah, and Hallie, I'll just say too, obviously we have to have categories to understand things, right? But some ideas cross all categories, so don't worry about that too. If you have an idea that kind of crosses multiple categories and you just want to get it in there, just put it wherever you think is most
Yeah.
appropriate. But Hallie, do you want to summarize some of these and then maybe guide folks through like the next one?
Yeah, so this one is energy, anything related to uh, grid resilience, accessibility, affordability. Um, and we've been on this one, I think, for a little while. So the next one would be personal exposure. I think actually you can click through them as you desire. Um, as far as I understand how Mentimeter works.
I'm I'm not sure because there's no responses yet on the next one. Have folks been able to answer the second one? You may have to advance the presentation on your end,
I
Hallie.
clicked on it and now you can
And meant to and put it in the wrong, put it in the first one. Oops.
it'll be okay. We'll sort them later. But I've advanced the slide and I re-clicked on the link and now it does say share possible research topic needs and ideas related to personal exposure, workplace, schools, and recreation. We have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-ish. So I don't know how much time we want to allocate to each one. Um,
Maybe a few minutes, but Hallie, I'm not sure if you can pull up the responses as they're coming in and just kind of read a few out to folks.
yeah,
Might spur some ideas, and then we can kind of move through each of them after a few minutes, right?
yeah. So while we're waiting on the personal exposure section, um, we can look at the energy ones that were submitted, including affordable energy related to energy consumption, especially for residents who rely on a fixed income. I know that is a big topic. We even talked about that at the Southern Arizona Heat Summit. Fixed income and definitely being related to looking at heat-related illness and mortality being in 65 and up. Definitely, so that fixed income definitely is a stacked risk factor. Mass power outages, aging HVAC, um, rooftop and renewable energy, looking at that, maybe researching heat planning for low-income, unsheltered, and mobile home communities. Those are very good answers for energy. All right, and personal exposure, seeing some good responses. So we'll go to the next one, which is public health. Everything related to public health, outreach, communication, public education. Seeing some really good responses to the personal exposure, youth playing outdoor sports in the heat. That's a very unexplored, I think, at this moment, at least from my understanding, research topic. Strategies for stopping people from hiking. Occupational settings, I think, for personal exposure isn't very interesting idea. Really like that one.
Yeah, I see the recommendation for a death review team. Um, and I think that's something we've has come up in the past. Uh, and I wonder how we make that happen. We've sort
Yeah, I
of
mean, I can just say where, I mean, I think
sure.
it basically, we just need to get a little bit of governmental support to protect the people who are part of the team and identify, a group that would meet on a monthly basis and then have access to data that comes from the coroner about what the circumstances were. I think the county, well, Rebecca knows all about this and Aaron, so we've talked about it. I think Dave probably, I mean, so I think essentially we just need to get access to the cases and get a group of people and get a little bit of money. It wouldn't cost much really, just to support the group with a coordinator. But really we need a little bit of kind of public protection for the work so that because, some of the identities of patients or the people and circumstances, could be somewhat protected. So being able to get protection for all the people who participated, which just would require some minimal legislation, it could be done. And I mean, and you can look at some of the other death review teams that have been put together, either in Arizona or other states, and kind of gives you an idea of how it's pretty easy to do.
Thank you. That was a very thoughtful response. We're moving on to our last management question, and this one is related to, I believe, emergency preparedness. Um, so if you have any ideas specifically related to emergency preparedness, we've been cooking up some incredibly good ideas in public health thus far. Someone after my own heart has written visualizing heat risk thresholds for different populations. I think visuals and communication are so critical for public health. That's a really good one. And another one that I see is the impact of artificial turf and micro nanoplastics on athletes as well as the local environment. I was just doing a literature review for our newsletter, and I saw an article about children exposure to microplastics, especially because when they heat up, they're more volatile, and children have a lower safety threshold. So that one's definitely people are looking at that. Definitely room for growth, but there is definitely one. They definitely have looked at that. So I think that's very interesting. And we'll give emergency preparedness a little longer, thinking about that. Our next one will be about mitigation. So back to urban design, land use, waste heat reduction. Um, so start pre-thinking about that.
And Mary, we can make these available to the whole group too, right? Because I think there are some really good ideas here, and we certainly don't want to just capture these and put them away. So I think we can make these available to everyone too.
Sure, yeah,
But I know we
absolutely.
also have some researchers joining us who might be able to maybe in the future answer some of these questions.
Yes, for sure. We will not be hoarding or gatekeeping the wonderful group think here. We'll move on to mitigation. I know this is a big one for folks. Uh, we included all four kind of aspects within this one, so anything heat mitigation related. The next one will be governance. If you have an idea for that and are waiting on it, there will be a spot to put that.
And
Anything?
again, we broke out the management into a few of the subcategories just because historically this group has been more focused on kind of the health aspects, but figured we wanted to give room for reducing heat in cities too, and then just the coordination aspects with governance, like I talked about. that's why the last two are a little bit shorter. And then we have a open-ended one at the very end. So if you have any final kind of thoughts that just didn't fit into any of the categories.
Yeah, and I'm seeing some really good responses in the emergency preparedness section relating to how to recognize heat as an emergency, ensuring populations know where to go and what to do, schools in particular, warnings and education. I think it's very telling that even if some of these things exist or have been researched, that um, clearly they're not reaching folks, reaching researchers, practitioners. So, even if some of these things are being done or addressed or researched, uh, bringing them up as a point that you haven't seen this is definitely valuable because then we know that that outreach and education piece is not reaching the folks it needs to. So, awesome. We'll give that 1 or 2 more minutes to give governance a good chunk of time.
And with these, Hallie, I'm seeing a lot of kind of similar themes about not just like tree planting, but kind of like energy, water use, the suite of different strategies that can be used, right? So kind of shows we've moved a little bit beyond the single silver bullet solutions and kind of have a more complex view of how to cool off cities a little bit better.
All right.
I don't
Just
see
in
mine
case
in
you.
there. I don't know if it went through.
Oh.
Oh, there it is. The covered sidewalks that have solar with cooling stations for people that are walking.
Mm.
Has there been any research on anything like that?
I don't know,
Let's
but
see.
then
Sorry, what was that?
I don't know about that, but I know there's some folks at U of A and public health that are looking at similar thing with like farming. So seems like somebody should for sidewalks because it's like a similar situation.
Yeah, if it could generate electricity, if there's solar panels on top and
Yeah.
generate electricity, and then you have cooling stations along the way, it would cool down, at least the people walking and the sidewalk itself, and then generate power.
Yeah, good idea. Thank you. All right, Hallie, you want to go to the next one? Oh, looks like you did. So the governance one is
Here it
open,
is.
right, Hallie?
Yeah, the governance one is up. So that's coordination, collaboration, resource sharing and or allocation, capacity building, um, everything that kind of sits in between. And I know a lot of these ideas also, like Lad said, they're overlapping and definitely include some parts of these sections that we delineated out, but um, this is a good one. You guys are coming up with very good ideas.
And while folks are finishing up providing comment for heat governance, I'll put this in the chat too. We actually do still have an active National Integrated Heat Health Information System at the federal level, and they do have some upcoming webinars that might be of interest to folks on various kind of heat research that's going on across the country. And so I believe it's on their front page, but just putting that in there. They also have some heat season warm-up workshops and things like that too that might be of interest.
Awesome. And in our last 5 minutes, I'll shift it over to the other section just in case you feel like your idea hasn't fit into any of the categories. But I sure see a lot of good ideas. Coalition building, I think, and collaboration is really important. Sharing our ideas and expertise with others is coming up here. I know that Arizona is definitely leading the way. We've been having other cities and other governments show up to some of the events that we've been holding, like the Heat Summit. We were able to connect with, I believe, the city of El Paso had come out from El Paso to be there. And yeah, any other resources, events, opportunities in the chat, feel free. Thanks, Jenny. That is super interesting. For those of us Phoenicians, those of you who are Phoenicians, you can go see a cool documentary film screening.
And maybe as we are wrapping this up, we will just note that our next meeting is going to be in May on what's the date? May 28th. And we hope to see you there. We're planning to have a presentation from the National Weather Service, specifically addressing the super El Nino, if you've heard about that at all in the news, and impacts it may have on us. And then we're also the plan is to get a bit of a summary of what we've received here to present, reflect back to the group, and hopefully we can move forward with a lot of these ideas.
Yeah, so I'll just wrap up my portion at least just by thanking everyone for your time today. And again, I just think we have a lot of great ideas that have been put into the Mentimeter. And if you think of any others, reach out to us after. But we'll, like Mary said, we'll summarize some of these. We'll get the list out to folks so everyone can have it and provide a summary of that at the May meeting, probably right before we have the presentation on the Super El Nino. So. Yeah, anything else, Mary, or from any other of the organizing committee members?
Just thanks, Lad, for a great presentation, and to you and Mary for facilitating good discussion.
Yep, thanks, Dave. Okay, I think
Thank-
everyone can
yeah,
take
thank
off
you,
if you're
everyone.
done. We'll probably leave this up for just another minute if there's any other feedback. But thank you for your time today, and we'll see you later.
Thank you so much.